Hey everyone, I wanted to go over the new and interesting news that we have for Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak on both the Nintendo Switch and on PC. And that's the fact that a user discovered that essentially Capcom in the most recent patch 11.02 decided to kind of nerf the game a little bit by adjusting the monster's tracking from the point of final attack to somewhere before it actually happens. Now this is going to get a little bit technical and I certainly don't want to confuse anyone here. But essentially the TLDR here is that the game has been made a little bit easier by Capcom and we're not necessarily too sure as to why. Now if you want to understand the full details, essentially back in February a user named Ryukishi discovered that essentially on PC, the higher the frame rate you ran the game from, so 60, 120 or 160 or even 200 frames, depending on whatever your computer can actually handle, the game's monster tracking essentially became more aggressive the faster the frame rates were. So people suggested that monsters' attacks were simply tied to the frame rate, not necessarily tied to just logical in-game AI. So it turned out that on Nintendo Switch, since the game runs essentially at 30 and is mostly capped for the most part, essentially the game is a little bit easier. If you're fighting monsters at 30 frames, not necessarily higher frame rates, this makes it so the monster's tracking is a little bit less aggressive, therefore you can have an easier time avoiding attacks. So it turned out that more recently, after 11.02 patch, a user called Titus69, I'm going to be leaving a link in the description below for their video, highly suggest you guys check it out, doing good work, essentially discovered that after this most recent patch, it turned out that Capcom addressed this ongoing issue that is now addressing monsters tracking being less aggressive than it was before. It isn't fully fixed, but it certainly adjusted it at some point in time, and he presumes, and most likely I agree with that it might have happened at the 11.02 patch, since the patch notes themselves don't actually point out any of this whatsoever. We've discussed this multiple times where Capcom puts this vague disclaimer, other miscellaneous bug fixes have been made pretty much in every single one of their patch notes, and we don't necessarily know what that means. They probably thought this was a little bit too complex to explain to users, therefore they just didn't even bother and they just left it as just some miscellaneous change. It turns out, however, that is a rather massive one that people should be taking advantage of if they haven't done so already. I will be completely transparent though. This is most likely one of those things that if you're kind of just used to playing the game already, is not really going to affect you. And if you're playing on the Nintendo Switch, chances are you're just kind of used to the game speed already. The game on Switch feels a little bit slower, a little bit more methodical, where on PC, it just because of the nature of the higher frame rates, it feels more fluid and a little bit faster by nature. That's just kind of like the way higher frame rates work. Monsters' attacks are not necessarily faster by any way, shape, or form, but because we knew the aggressiveness of the monsters was tied to the frame rates, it felt a little bit more aggressive. So what it turned out was that you needed to use like wire bugs and evades and step dodges, side steps and stuff like that to be able to get out of some really disgusting attacks, like for example Malzeno's tail swipe or tail spike. You should be seeing that clip from his video right there, or Kushala Doora's big kind of like pounce on top of you as well. That's another one of those like attacks that they were like really aggressive with the tracking. It seems like after that patch, this is no longer the case. He actually mentions that in his video. Essentially, he just kind of like walks out of the way of the attack and it no longer hits him. He doesn't necessarily need to dodge out of the way or silk bind out of the way or anything like that. Just basically a simple just trot out of the way is more than enough, where before it was just pretty much an instant guaranteed hit because essentially the monster's tracking was extremely aggressive. Now, if you don't know what it means tracking wise, all that means is that it's the angle relative from the attack from the monster towards you. So for example, if Magnamalo is going to do his stealth spike, the same attack that I showed a couple of clips of already, if he's going to do that and you're standing still and you move in the last minute, his tracking used to be that pretty much at the point of impact, at the point of it's about to release his tail out of like his body, that was pretty much still his angle of his attack was still shifting based on your movement laterally, whether you're moving left or right. Now, essentially what they did is that at some point in time, between the point of him starting the animation of the tail spike attack and somewhere in between the beginning and the point of like impact, his attack and the angle shifts a little bit and it just stays in one place. So if you just continue moving right or continue moving left without even having to dodge, essentially you just get out of the way completely and you don't get hit. Now that doesn't mean that AoE attacks are not going to hit you. That's still going to be a thing. But for specific attacks like that Tail Spike, for example, Tetranodon's Sumo Grab, the Kushala do Aura Pounce, a lot of people have suggested as well the T-Ostra kind of like Big Bang explosion that he does, although that's an AoE attack. Some of those are easier to dodge nowadays than they were before because the tracking is just not specifically tied to the frame rate, so you can just get out of the way a little bit easier. Now, all in all, I see this as a good change. It would have been great if Capcom would have decided to actually share the details to everyone as to why it is that they decided to do it. This, again, I have to reiterate, this was mentioned originally back all the way in February from Ryukishi's. Once again, I'm going to leave a link in the description below for their video, as they were extremely thorough breaking that down. I made a video a couple of weeks later after that, giving him a huge shout out, making sure people paid attention to that, because it was one of those like key feature things that it felt extremely different from the Nintendo Switch version, which is the version that I have been playing since launch, up until the release of the PC version, which I played for quite a bit, up until now Sunbreak, which I just shifted back to Switch. And it just felt like a big difference playing on PC. And now it seems like that difference is kind of completely gone for the most part. Now, it still seems like the tracking is very aggressive and the frame rates still kind of mess around with it a little bit. But it seems like for the most part, this isn't gonna something that is gonna like really make or break your hunting experience any longer. Now, one of the things that he does make mention in his video, and this would be Titus69, once again, link in the description below for their video, is that he's not necessarily too thrilled with the counter mechanic, essentially you having to get out of the way, silk bind attacks, dodging out of the way to be able to get out of a monster's attack. It should be a more natural flow to combat, something that the original game's prior releases, if you will, had. This one made it more aggressive for monsters to kind of get at you, so you have to counter it by just getting out of the way by using one of the game's tools provided, and he's not a big fan of that. I don't necessarily know how to feel about that, realistically speaking. I haven't really thought about it. I kind of always thought that, you know, they provided us the wire bug, the silk bind attacks, and that things of nature simply because they just, you know, they're better tools as a hunter. They make the game better, they make the game faster, and for me personally, I have no real issue with it. But certainly it did make me think that other people, specifically players who have been playing the game for quite a while, or more used to the more naturally feel of it, where essentially you had to get out of the way by just naturally just playing, not necessarily having to depend on like counters or anything along those lines. So it certainly gives me a little bit of pause to consider the way monsters are tied to their movements and the way counters actually work in the game. So once again, link in the description below for Ryukishi's video from back all the way in February, and link in the description below for Titus69's video in the link description below. Once again, huge shout out to him for making that discovery. I have to be quite honest, because I've not necessarily been playing the PC version all that much. I didn't necessarily pay attention to any of that. I didn't see anyone else cover this. Someone hit me up, told me about it. They were like, hey, didn't you actually talk about this a few months back? And I was like, yep. So I certainly thought it was worth bringing up once again, since this is finally seems to be an issue that was, you know, finally addressed. If you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.